Greetings, everybody, and welcome to another installment of Masters of Craft.
Trauma of money is a paradigm shift, and the paradigm shift is that if we live in this dominant economic culture, we're all impacted by trauma of money. One of the reasons why trauma of money is different than like financial psychology or financial therapy, we orient in this like broader landscape of collective trauma. What are the impacts of extractive capitalism? What are the impacts of patriarchy? What are the impacts of colonialism and all of these different layers? What are some of the thoughts or the narratives that are showing up when you're about to interact with your pricing or you're about to have a conversation with someone around money? I'm not worthy of charging this much. No one's gonna accept this. Is this good enough? And like you've got all these thoughts coming in, and maybe there's some shame arising. We say like, whose shame is this? Or whose judgment is this? Or whose fear is this? Whose imposter syndrome is this?
Speed. You want to do some speed? You like drugs? Greetings, everybody, and welcome to another installment of Masters of Craft. In case you're tuning in for the first time, this show, basically, it's a few of my favorite things. These are a few of my favorite things. I've been taking vocal lessons. How did that sound to you?
Pretty good. Yeah. Good range.
Shout out to YouTube for my lessons. No, thank you. Chantel Chapman, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for wearing your Canadian tuxedo.
No problem.
Represent the home territory.
Yeah, that's right.
So you run a company called Trombone of Money, or is it
Trauma of Money?
Trauma of Money. Okay. Research team. You guys, tell us about Trauma of Money, and also as you do that, give us the aha moment of when it became a thing for you. Like, oh my gosh, this is.
Oh, yeah. Okay. This is a bit of a long story. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready for a long story. We got nothing but time.
Okay. So Trauma of Money is a professional certification program that certifies professionals, mainly trauma therapists, social workers, financial professionals, HR professionals, not-for-profit professionals in a trauma-sensitive approach to money. And so we take a little bit of financial psychology, we take the psychology of scarcity, we look at systems and society, and we go through all those layers and explore how those layers impact the relationship with money. So
there's a lot of layers to
yeah,
that. Like,
yeah.
And the aha moment, like what were you doing at the time when you're like, I'm gonna do a Trauma of Money course?
Yeah. So, I mean, it started out with, there was like a series of little aha moments that led to one really big aha moment. And, you know, I started my career in finance at 21, and I was a mortgage broker, and that was very challenging because most people would look at me and be like, are you even old enough to sign a contract? And you're trying to lend me hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I couldn't get any clients. The only clients I could get were people who were declined. And I didn't know this at the time, but I am a recovering people pleaser, and saying no to someone, telling someone that they're declined, was heartbreaking to me. So rather than saying, yeah, you know what, you really are declined, I ended up saying to someone, it's just not yet. And so let me do everything I can possibly do to get you to a place where you can get approved. So I ended up teaching financial literacy to my clients, essentially. And as I was doing that, I felt a lot of emotions around that. Like I felt a sense of like injustice around the fact that a lot of people, you know, couldn't fulfill their dreams because of an issue on their credit score, or, you know, like something to do with their income and the way the taxes were being filed. And I felt these strong feelings because behind the scenes of my professional image, I had a lot of credit card debt. I was filing my taxes late. I was just kind of a bit of a mess with money. And even though I'm like a financial professional, I also didn't know a lot of the things that I had to quickly learn to be able to teach my clients. So that was like the first aha moment that led to Trauma of Money, but that was many years ago. But at the time, my level of awareness only told me that I needed to teach financial literacy. And I thought, well, if I had only learned this in high school, I wouldn't be in this position. So I opened up a financial literacy business, and my business at the time was called Holler for Your Dollar.
So it's a strip club.
Exactly.
Nice.
I know, it's very cringe when I look back on it now.
Does that URL still exist? Can we go look up the archived files from Holler for Your Dollar?
Oh gosh. Yeah, it's embarrassing. But
you had to start somewhere.
I had to start somewhere.
In your 20s,
yeah. And the teenagers liked it. You know, it was like, you could have a banker come in and teach you about money, or you can have Holler for Your Dollar. And so they liked it. But the thing that I noticed really quickly was that teenagers are very present oriented. So they're like all about now. They're not often caring too much about their future credit score or retirement or things like that. So I didn't feel like I was really making an impact. And so I started teaching adults about financial literacy. And I noticed really quickly, like, I had this very approachable way about my delivery around a topic that people have a lot of shame around. And this was at like the beginning of the whole content marketing space. So this is like right when Instagram was getting started up. This is also at the beginning of like fintech organizations. And so I was noticed by a fintech organization, and they were like, please come in and help us with our strategy. So that led me to like going in and consulting in the fintech space for many years. And at that point, I became a media spokesperson around financial literacy. So, you know, if you would see me like in the media in Canada, it would be noted as like Canada's credit score expert and things like that.
Nice.
Yeah.
I didn't know this about you. I'm learning so much in this small amount of time. And I have a point to make about that in a second.
Yeah. And so so people would see that on the outside, but behind the scenes, my financial situation was still very challenged. Even though I believed financial literacy will help people, I taught financial literacy. I knew it in and out, but my financial situation didn't change.
Right.
So I was making more money than I've ever made, but my credit was still not great. I was always filing taxes late. I was racking up debt. I was using my money like a please, love, and accept me fund. So any money I had, it would be spent on receiving external validation. So whether that be like buying everyone dinner, you know, like going to the club and getting a bottle. Hey, I'm on a recovery journey, so that won't be happening.
Might get a meal out of you. All right, never mind.
It may, but and it was just overspending and people pleasing, and I was also under earning. So while I was making a lot more money than I've ever made, I was under earning significantly. And I had an experience in my life where someone who I love very much came to me and said, I need your help. I'm at a detox center on the downtown east side in Vancouver. And the downtown east side in Vancouver is a very densely populated area of folks who are experiencing houselessness and substance use addiction. There's a lot of trauma in this place. And he called me, he's like, I'm at a detox center here and I've been addicted to heroin and fentanyl and I need your help. So I showed up and I was like, I'm gonna help you get into recovery. We couldn't find a place for him to go. So he ended up going to what's called a halfway house, which was transitioning men out of incarceration who are addicted to substances. So we placed him there, and I would go there every single day. I would make food for the men. I would meditate with them. I was basically being in that like people-pleasing codependency. Let me make your recovery my responsibility role. And when I was there, I was having all these conversations, and I'm like, why are you all here? And he had said to me, he's like, my whole life I had felt these feelings of like inadequacy, and it's like it was looping in my brain, like you're never good enough, and you're not accepted and you're a piece of shit and all these different narratives. And the moment I was using, those voices calmed. And even though it was so destructive for my life, like I didn't feel that like self-hate that I had for myself. And when he said that, that was the biggest aha moment. I was like, oh my gosh, I relate to you so much. Of course, I don't relate in the way that I was using fentanyl and heroin.
Well, it's something like we all go through, right?
Yeah.
Where we all mask, feelings of inadequacy in whatever way, whether it's through humor or through sex or like whatever it might be. The mechanism is still there.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was the aha moment. And I was like, what is mine? And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's the way it's this like people pleasing and this codependency and this, in the trauma world, we call it fawning as a trauma response, like people pleasing as a trauma response. And it's manifesting in the way I interact with my money. And so my whole career where I really wanted to make an impact around money, I completely missed the mark. And I'm like thinking it's education, but it's actually this piece, like these behaviors around money are soothing pain. And so that was when I went on a multi-year research journey, and which eventually led to Trauma of Money.
I keep thinking about the name Trauma of Money. And it's not holler for your dollar, right?
No.
There's no poetry to it. It's like you're telling it is what it is.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about naming conventions, and we all try to come up with clever names for the things that we want to create. Like, why did you decide to like hit the nail on the head with what it is?
Well, originally it was like mindful money, but we wanted to talk about trauma, and it was trauma, and it felt so important to name it. One of the slogans from the trauma world is "You name it to tame it," and so we're like, well, what about Trauma of Money or Money of Trauma? And it just felt right. Like it just landed. Trauma of Money just landed. And it was so brilliant because I never thought about the SEO of it. But
right. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah. It's been incredible, the name for the business, because people are searching trauma, money, and we come up everywhere.
Well, I also think there's like stigma, right? I think when people listen to this conversation or hear you talk or come across it, I mean, my personal story was like, I don't know, I was like scrolling through Instagram, I saw Trauma of Money, like, oh, that's interesting. What is it? And because I'm nosy and curious.
Yeah.
And also I was like, I felt some kind of way when I saw it.
Yeah.
And then once I got into what the material was and what the brand looked like and all the things that could probably impact things that I was experiencing, you and I ended up in a conversation. And then, 15 weeks later, like, but I think there is like, oh, that's for those people. And you've also worked with CEOs and startups and banks and like universities. Walk us through like destigmatizing what trauma means when it comes to finance and money.
Yeah. So, I was having a conversation the other day with one of our faculty members who's a trauma therapist. And we were talking about, is trauma of money like steps of how to interact with your money, or is it a paradigm shift? And I was thinking about that question, and I feel it's both, because trauma of money is a paradigm shift, and the paradigm shift is that if we live in this dominant economic culture, we're all impacted by trauma of money. And one of the reasons why trauma of money is different than like financial psychology or financial therapy is we orient in this like broader landscape of collective trauma as well. So what are the impacts of, extractive capitalism? What are the impacts of patriarchy? What are the impacts of colonialism and all of these different layers? And also we root in individual traumas that someone may experience. And one way to simply describe trauma is by categorizing it into big T trauma or little t trauma. So big T trauma is something that, we would collectively agree that is very traumatic. So just giving a content warning here, I'm going to talk about abuse and so sexual abuse, an accident, physical violence, war, big T trauma. And then there's little T trauma, which might be things like microaggressions or, you know, even like attachment wounding that you have in childhood with your parents. So there was a significant period of time where the parenting advice was leave the baby in the crib to cry it out. Teach your child to toughen up. And now all the trauma therapists are saying, your children have attachment trauma. Right? And so even that, and that was like the norm for parenting for many people. And so that could be an example of even little T trauma. And little T trauma is like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right?
Yeah.
And this trauma therapist I was talking with last week, Shulamit, or this week about, you know, what trauma of money is. She's like, big T trauma explodes and little T trauma erodes. And when we're talking about trauma of money is a combination of the little T trauma and the big T trauma. And to put it very simply, trauma is something that happens to us that leaves wounding and essentially impacts our sense of worthiness and security. What does money represent in our society?
It's everything. Like, it's literally everything.
It's worth and security. So if you have wounding around worth and security and you're interacting with the resource that represents worth and security, there's clearly going to be some challenges.
Now, when I think about the entrepreneurial startup person or the creative entrepreneur, like, there's so much other types of emotional hurdles to get through, whether it's like, oh, I see a vision for the world, everybody's telling me no, right? Let alone once I'm actually on track and I'm billing and I'm pricing and I'm doing all these things. It's all something we all struggle with, where you're like, how much should I charge for this? Or have I graduated to a new rate? Or should we increase our prices? Am I going to pay more for Netflix or cancel it? Like, what, where do you find the decision tree? Like, where does it derail for people, or how do you incorporate all the different components into the one sort of path forward?
Yeah, so we have developed the trauma of money method, which is a 6-step approach to interacting with your finances. And this can be like macro or micro. So you could apply this approach when, making a decision around pricing, for example. So step 1 is always like noticing what's the state of your nervous system and what are some of the thoughts or the narratives that are showing up when you're about to interact with your pricing or you're about to have a conversation with someone around money. So some of those narratives might be like, I'm not worthy of charging this much. No one's going to accept this. Is this good enough? And like, you've got all these thoughts coming in, and maybe there's some shame arising. And we love to ask this question. We say like, whose shame is this? Or whose judgment is this? Or whose fear is this? Whose imposter syndrome is this? And we ask that question to create an opening of unpacking that and saying like, oh, the shame is actually capitalism, or the shame is, I grew up hearing my dad say rich people are assholes, and I'm trying to like reject money subconsciously. And we start to like understand and depersonalize these narratives a bit. And then from there, we take care of the nervous system. And, taking care of the nervous system requires us to have a subtle awareness of like what's happening even in the body. So like, what's my temperature? What's happening with my heart rate? Do I feel any anxiety in my chest? Do I feel nauseous? And when we are noticing those, that's an invitation to pause. That's an invitation to slow down and do something to help regulate ourselves, to bring us back into the window of tolerance, or we like to use the language, the window of resilience, where we can act in a more effective way with more parts of our brain, more executive functioning, more fluid intelligence, more decision-making abilities.
That was one of the things I wrote down, was just like, and I took the course and Showed up live every week, 3 hours each week. It was very intense and interpersonal and all the things. And as I was thinking about this conversation today, the thing that popped into my head was pause. Like that was one of the key things I learned, whether it's a business decision or I'm like at Target, it's just like, do I really need the Barbasol?
Yeah.
Shout out to Barbasol. Not a sponsor yet, but when we see Caleb's mustache, we're going to cut it off live on air. Please. No, sorry, Caleb. No, but it's just like this idea of like pausing and you go, all right, it could be a feel-good spin, right? Like I have kids and I'm like, oh, I want to get my son these shoes or the school supplies. I'm like, do I need the... I like the fact that you brought that up, like that, like pausing before the decision making.
Yeah. And I actually created these stickers that I give away to people, at events that go on your credit card or your debit card. And one of them says, "What is the why of the buy?" And it's an invitation to pause when you buy. Or another one, this comes from the 12-step recovery world. Halt. Before I act, am I hungry, angry, lonely, tired? And I think it's important, especially in, the consumerism world, that we do pause, because that's where our agency around decision-making comes from. If anyone's ever done a marketing course, you learn about like manipulative tactics and like using the psychology of scarcity to convince people to do things that they might actually not want to do. So it's important for our agency to have pause.
You mentioned something earlier about like what we used to think was the right way of doing things, like let the baby cry. And then you're like, no, actually that was wrong. We've been doing it wrong for decades or hundreds of years even. And we can talk about like DNA and things that show up but also like, how do you just keep up with the shifts and trends and new information and apply that to the course and make the adjustments? Because I think is in any business, right? Like there's always new information coming out. You have to make a decision on how you're going to pivot your business based on what you just learned. And discernment becomes a thing. Like how does that work in your world?
Well, actually, our tagline at Trauma of Money is decrease shame, increase discernment. So it's very much part of our values to be discerning. And in our Trauma of Money 6-step method, the last phase is refinement. And also, in the psychology of scarcity, one of the interventions for scarcity, or the belief that you're in scarcity, is something called fault tolerance. And because I worked in fintech and I was trained in agile technology development project management, I was taught about being in, like, creating in a zone of iteration. And when you're in that place, there's no fault, there's just learning. And because that's such a big part of our values, if we say, you know what, we're changing the curriculum and we taught that before and that's not true anymore, I don't feel bad about it. I feel actually really proud because we're embodying our values and we're modeling that for people. And there was one thing we were teaching about the neuroanatomy of the brain when you get activated. And psychologists for many years were teaching about this concept that like the prefrontal cortex goes off and you go into the survival part of the brain and it's like the reptilian part of the brain. Well, the new neuroscience is like that teaching is based on hierarchies within species. It's like speciesism. And it's actually not true that, like, basically that teaching says that reptiles are inferior to humans, and it's one of the narratives and propaganda that was used to, perpetuate some of the ideas in capitalism that humans are allowed to extract from earth, animals, because we're at the top. And psychology continued teaching that. We even taught that in our first two cohorts. And then when we came across the new neuroscience, we now teach that we used to teach it and now we don't. And here's why.
Right.
And so we use like the wrong way as part of the teaching.
That's getting goosebumps from that story because yes, like the way we digest the information, the science, the societal information, and even especially now where voices in culture are kind of like giving more rise, even on your website, right? Like when you go to Trauma of Money, you are honoring the land. And tell me like where elements like that came from, you know, and explain the land thing. And then just kind of like this sort of always on mindfulness, like even listening to you, right? Your language is very, you practiced, but like deliberate and you know, inclusive. I guess I'll say that. But like, let's talk about the land and then how wide the lens goes when it comes to the different cultural elements that go into the work.
I saw a meme the other day, and it was like, someone's like, "Oh, you have a good personality," and they're like, "Thanks. It's just a bunch of trauma responses."
Like, I'm really crying inside.
Yeah, and I was like, you know, my inclusive language, I think, comes from a trauma response, and that's part of like post-traumatic growth is, you know, we do go through these experiences that deepen our awareness. And because of some of the experiences that I had gone through, and because of this like people pleasing and, you know, hypervigilance of my external surroundings, I have developed this strong ability to be, to try to be at most times very aware of the things that I say. But the inclusivity is a huge value of Trauma of Money because of our tagline, decrease shame, increase discernment. When I worked in financial literacy, I found that there was very much like, you do this, you're good, you do that, you're bad. And that just resulted in so much shame. And so when I was thinking about designing a new way of interacting with money, it felt extremely important to include and elevate multiple worldviews around money. And I'm a white settler woman, and
Woo!
I've only had I've only had so many experiences around money, so I couldn't be the only person teaching it. So we had to bring in like multiple experiences and backgrounds around money, because our paradigm shift is the environment that we live in impacts the relationship with money. So you have to hear from multiple voices. Part of that also is like taking a decolonized approach, which is, you know, moving away from like that this or that type thinking. There's only, you know, one right way to do things, the paternalism and all of these aspects of the colonization that have been like forced on people. Right. And so in any area that we could try to decolonize, we will. And part of that is like the truth and reconciliation approach of honoring the land and whose land is it. So, you know, the work that where I work and where I live is on the stolen territory of the Musqueam, Kwantlen, Tsawwassen people, which are the stewards of that land that I live in, but it's been stolen from them. And how can we teach about money, and how can we talk about, you know, capitalism without honoring and acknowledging that history, even as painful as it is? But it's so important for us because, you know, I really believe like we are all connected, and I can't fully heal my relationship with money until we're all well and we're all on that path of healing.
Thank you for
and
that.
Getting access.
Before I bring Caleb and his mustache in, we've had conversations about C-suite leaders, especially when they're managing budgets. It could be 6, 8, 9-figure budgets, and how a lot of organizations operate from this place of scarcity and demand, and also not realizing like the people that are on their teams also have their own trauma that they're dealing with. If I get fired, I'm not gonna be able to pay my rent. If I don't pay my rent, I'm gonna have to go live with my mom. I hate my mom. Like there's this like domino thing that happens in our heads. How do you train organizations to be aware, especially when there's like, oh, the C-suite is like, I'm fine, we don't need this, and then, but you're not like thinking about the entirety of the organization and even how you're operating it.
Yeah. So that happens often where, the C-suites might say, oh yeah, this will be great for my staff who are in this income class, but I don't need this. And one of the ways we introduce them to the work that they connect with is through the psychology of scarcity. And so the brain doesn't know the difference between being in scarcity or the belief that we're in scarcity. And maybe they don't have money scarcity, but do they have time scarcity? Do they have connection scarcity? Do they have, scarcity in many different resources, even emotions? And so we teach how basically when scarcity is present, you have a reduced cognitive capacity. And if you go to the website, the American Economic Association, and you look at the definition of economics, it says it's the management of scarcity. So scarcity has been built into our economic system, yet scarcity impacts the brain and basically mirrors a trauma response. So impacting decision-making, fluid intelligence, creativity, being able to move out of this or that thinking and being like, wait, there's multiple options here. So the moment we start talking about it in that way to executives and talking about time scarcity and how, scarcity is so built into the economic system that you may not even realize some of the values of scarcity that you are threading through your entire organization. All of a sudden we frame it like that, they're like, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
Caleb, where'd you go? Did you leave? Yeah. Were you upset that I kept talking about your mustache and your long, gorgeous hair?
I know you love my mustache. It's fine.
I'm just jealous of it.
Tracks.
Yeah, my jealousy tracks. Thanks. See, that's where my trauma comes in. I'm big T pain. What's up?
This is really. I love this conversation a lot, and we talked about this when you were talking about bringing her on about how much you and I have faced of like I didn't even think of this as an existing thing until I heard about you and what you do, and I'm like, oh, I might fall into this category deeply. Of like having
that's the one thing. It's like you think it's not for you, and then you start reading, and you're like, oh, or you hear this conversation, and you're like, oh, wait.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think you're talking about C-suites. I think one of the things that I also think about a lot too when it comes to C-suite leadership too is like, as I continue down the path of growing and figuring out this for myself, I'm also thinking about like as I pay employees and like get the team built, like I know there's more of that for them, and I'm just wondering like ways to be empathetic and like help lead in a way that is empathetic to financial trauma of the team members I have as well, because in a way that's also appropriate. I don't know what that looks like, but I didn't know if you have just advice or for whether CEOs or just other leaders that are trying to be cognizant of that for their people.
Yeah, so you're asking about working with your team members who have financial trauma and how to navigate those conversations.
Yeah, or even how to identify it.
Yeah, well, I just think it's a given that every single person has their own experience with money, and there's probably been challenges along the way in some form of or another. A lot of people make an assumption that financial trauma or trauma of money is only associated with people who have experienced loss or poverty, but it's absolutely not true. And a really great example of this is that show Succession, which that is like a case study for financial trauma.
Yeah.
And so, I think that level of awareness is really helpful. Is when you have staff, you just say like, they might show up and do odd things that are different than the way I would do it around money. And the empathy is understanding that they have a whole lifetime, not even just their lifetime, but what did their ancestors go through around money that is showing up when they ask you for a raise, or when they, are late on an invoice, or when they are late on submitting expenses. It's so much more than just the behavior. There's like a whole story behind it.
I'll give you an example of that. I was kind of like at a point in time in my life brokering deals between like startups and organizations, and a friend of mine was like, yo, are you getting a piece of those? And I was like, no, I'm just, blah, blah, blah. And she's black, and she was like, was almost like pissed off at me. And she goes, she's like, like most of us when we grew up, it was like our parents didn't have much, and you don't ask for more. Like you get what you get, and don't ask me for nothing else. And now, like here I am in a business setting, and I'm like, that is showing up very subconsciously. Like, oh, I didn't realize I was stutter stepping or selling myself short because of a habit that I learned very, very early on.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, and I think for me, and I think it shows up a little differently, but I even think that you talked earlier about how there's some other interconnected things that might lead to financial trauma that's not actually financially related. And I think about in equating to that, like one of the things that I was always taught growing up is like, you don't ask for things, you don't invite yourself into things like in general. And just like, I've found that showing up even in business where I'm afraid to ask for money because I don't want to, invite myself. It's like almost inviting myself into like getting more.
Yeah.
Right. I almost feel like, and maybe it's imposter syndrome, but also it's like a bit of that just.
And I want to couple that with a point, which is like the transition. Once you have that awareness and then you start to step out of that space, that can be very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And it can take a lot longer of a time than you expect. And I want you to correct me if you agree or disagree.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. And so there's a teaching in financial psychology called the financial comfort zone. And basically what they say, and this comes from Dr. Brad and Ted Klons, who are two financial psychologists here in the US, they say that the way you grow up around money and like the stories you've been told around money become essentially your comfort zone. And this is why, folks who grow up in poverty, if they get a lot of money from, maybe they're playing like professional sports, for example, they may end up the rates of bankruptcy, et cetera, are really high if they grew up in poverty. And they say that's because the financial comfort zone. And this is very true that our nervous system gets comfortable even in chaos if that's what we're used to. So if we grew up being told a certain thing, or we grew up and there was chaos around money, we will feel most comfortable in that environment as adults. And so when you have the awareness of that and you try and do something different, it's going to be so uncomfortable. And we actually invite discomfort in. And that becomes the meter of like, are you changing something? So when I work with entrepreneurs who are under earning or undercharging, the first thing we want to do is, okay, we're going to get uncomfortable here. But we don't just like throw ourselves in discomfort. We sandwich it with like nervous system support. So we're going to sit and do some pricing exercises. But after this, we're going to go outside and be in nature, or we're going to, watch some comedy, or we're going to do something to care and nourish our nervous systems. Folks, for example, who grow up in like quite a bit of chaos, they might produce more cortisol, so more stress hormone. And if that's what your body is used to, you will recreate situations to increase the cortisol. So I'll see people constantly being late for things because when you're really late or you procrastinate, cortisol increases. And
why did you look at me like that?
Yeah. And the nervous system's like, whoa, this is familiar. This feels good,
Yeah.
So.
I mean, and yes, it tracks.
I didn't mean to put you on, but look, I'm the opposite. Like I'm like on time, and I have this like an air of perfectionism, and I have to let that go. And like I was raised by a single mom who grew up in the projects herself, turned her life around, and so like everything was like tuck your shirt in, like don't use that word, use this word. And so when I show up and it was like somebody's 5 minutes late, I'm like, what the.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it is sort of like but I'm very much aware of it, and I have to like regulate my own nervous system. And I think, with that, what other sort of practices do you recommend that people couple with their trauma of money training or revisiting? Like, is it meditation? Is it therapy? Is it drink a bottle of vodka, like during class, which like I did. Sorry, no. What do you advise?
Yeah. So, trauma of money is a psychoeducation program. So we are not a substitute.
I don't think we use the term psycho.
Oh, sorry.
Just kidding. Okay, I'll stop.
Are you going to backtrack that comment about my
nope.
aware language?
Yes, she was afraid to go to jail earlier when we were talking before the cameras in the restaurant.
That's my trauma.
Yes.
Am I going to go to jail?
That's why you wore all blue today. You
exactly.
Prison blues.
Hey, make it an easy transition.
Exactly. You'll leave here, get in the paddy wagon.
Yeah, exactly.
And, this will be the last.
My comfort zone. My comfort zone.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought prison uniforms were orange.
It depends on which prison.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Canadian prisons are Pastels.
We're much more polite.
Yeah, exactly.
Much more polite.
Are these cups too tight? No, they're fine.
Sorry, I moved too much. I have a joke about that. I'm like, say, who apologizes more than a Canadian codependent?
Wow,
That's me.
it's dark.
Yeah.
Speaking of jokes, I'm gonna just segue.
Yeah.
I know you were gonna answer. I forgot where we were, but
Yeah.
I did too.
Here's what I did.
Yeah.
I asked ChatGPT
Yeah.
to create funny or fun interview questions based on your
Oh.
profile,
Okay.
and it gave me 12.
Oh, wow.
So I'm gonna ask you to pick 3 numbers between 1 and 12.
2,
Okay.
6,
Okay.
10.
All right. You want to do number 2?
Yeah, are we gonna play
I mean, don't
popcorn
do
here?
number 2. I mean, read the question.
You're right. Thanks.
I know you're nervous.
You're giving me new trauma right now is what's happening. As the co-founder of Trauma of Money, have you ever encountered a money-related situation that was so bizarre or hilarious that that could only be described as a financial fiasco?
Oh, financial fiasco. Oh, there is one, but I don't think I can share
You don't want to
it.
tell that person's business?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
All right,
I
you
don't
can opt out
know.
of it. We can move
I
on.
think,
You're gonna pass?
there's one, but they were really impacted by it, so I'm not going to say
Can we call the person? Just call them or put them on speakerphone?
I think she lives in Norway, so I don't know.
Yes. We don't even. It's not even available in Norway. Let's go.
You want me to say it?
Okay.
Well, there was a spiritual, spiritual educator that was trying to teach this person about manifesting and loosening their grip on money, and they basically had them burn money. Yeah.
That is a fiasco.
Yeah.
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 Shout out to Norway.
So we had to do a lot
Don't-
of work around that.
Don't bank in Norway.
Yeah.
And anyway, number 6. Imagine you were creating. By the way, I didn't read any of these questions, so
Oh, okay.
That's how responsible I am. Imagine you were creating a fun theme park centered around money education. What would be the craziest ride or attraction, and how would it teach visitors about financial responsibility?
Oh my gosh, that's a really hard question.
Like a house of mirrors. Like that's the first thing that comes to mind for me. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Like a fun house?
Well, yeah, like because we all have different shapes, sizes, and relationships with money.
That's
and
a
how
good
we see ourselves.
idea.
Or
That's
also
a good idea.
A lot of us on financial roller coasters.
A lot.
Yes, yes.
The theme park in and of itself would be.
It's an analogy to everything.
Yeah, exactly.
By the way, is this bit
that's
failing?
good. No, I don't have anything. That's
What?
I think we're answering the questions more than she's answering
Yeah.
the questions.
I feel like we're giving you a safety net. All right, you do number 10.
Popcorn. Oh, yeah. In your extensive research in addiction and behavioral science, have you ever come across a quirky money-saving hack that left you both impressed and amused?
Acorns.
acorns.
Oh, wait,
Like
you
the
guys
app?
not have acorns? Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you.
What?
You got never mind. You probably guys don't have acorns.
What do
It's
you
like
mean?
it's like an app where you spend money and it takes like a small percentage of what you like. It doesn't round up like the
Yeah, the
change
dollar
and,
amount
and
and
puts
then-
it into savings basically.
Oh.
So if like you spent like $5.86, you would get 14 cents put into your savings. It would round it
okay.
up to
Got it.
6.
I'm sure we have things like that. I know when I worked in fintech, that was like a offering that they were trying to add into different accounts. But
Fair.
well, I can't think of one that I've heard, but I have a tip that I used to teach to teenagers called Netflix and Chill your credit card.
You love talking to teenagers. What does that mean?
So basically, if you find yourself in a position where you're racking up credit card debt a lot, what you do is you have your credit card pay your Netflix bill, and then have your bank account auto pay that each month. Take your credit card, put it in a Ziploc bag with water, and then chill it in the freezer so you don't use it, but it's still being active because it's paying for Netflix. So you're like building your credit score without racking up your debt. So that's how you Netflix and chill
Make that
your credit card.
Wow.
I appreciate that. The show's called Masters of Craft. You're aware of this.
Yes. Yeah.
I also think in some ways mastery is an illusion.
Yes. Yeah.
That's why we're all back. I'm gonna make Caleb disappear in a minute. What is something in your life or career that you're still trying to master or you want to master?
Well, my personal belief is that we're always in a state of refinement. So I feel like anything that I value or try and do, it's always just, it's going to be a life of like refining it until it, and I don't think that'll ever end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thank you. I thank you
Yeah.
for being here.
Yeah. Thank you for having me here.
Do you have any questions for me or Caleb?
No.
Wow. So much for a two-way street.
I know. Oh, you know what? Actually,
uh-huh.
when reciprocity is not present, the nervous system feels a threat to safety. So that's why you're a little
I don't feel threatened by you.
uncomfortable that I don't have questions for you.
I'm not here to be asked questions. But when you have a podcast and you want
Yeah,
to
yes,
bring
yeah.
just a weird person on.
Yeah,
I'm
I would
all
love
for
to
it.
have you on.
Everyone, thank you for tuning in to this installment of Master. Why are you laughing at me?
You're doing great.
Chantel, thank you.
Thank you.
How
It's
can
great
people
to-
find more? Like, where did we go? Where do we follow you? Where do we learn more about Trauma of Money?
You can find us on Instagram at Trauma of Money, at Chantel Chapman, or our website is www.thetraumaofmoney.com.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.